Wetlands Program Coordinator for the DNR, Ecological and Water Resource Division. Current position, Wetlands Program Coordinator, said that. St. Paul responsibilities include wetland policy development, providing technical assistance on wetlands, developing wetlands-related data such as updated national wetland inventory maps and wetland status and trend data, and administering the DNR's regulatory responsibilities for calcareous fens. Doug graduated from Purdue University with a bachelor's degree in wildlife and from University of Missouri, note that, Dan, with an MS in fisheries and wildlife. With that, it's all yours, Doug.
You get a second one.
Oh, good. Do you have makeup too?
I do.
Yeah.
You look marvelous.
Thank you. All right, thanks, Bruce. First of all, I want to thank the folks that put the agenda together with their creative use of adjectives in the title, long-standing natural resource professionals. So I'm going to use that from now on. I'm not getting old, I'm just long-standing, so appreciate that. And also, since Bruce blew the cover on our musical background, I will reveal and confirm that Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds really was about LSD. So, okay, so as I was putting this talk together, as some of Dan ran into some of the same things, it seemed like many of the changes and the things that I've observed in my career were bad. And it got to be a little depressing, and I got to thinking, well, surely there's got to be some good things that we can point out that I've seen over the time that I've been working with wetlands. And it occurred to me that this is one of them right here. And Dan mentioned this as well. Trumpeter swans used to be extremely rare in the state's wetlands, and now they're pretty common. So that's a positive thing that I would point out. But from here, it's kind of downhill. So, so I'd like to start with a definition of wetlands. So you've probably all heard the definition of wetlands, that they're lands transitional between aquatic and terrestrial habitats, blah, blah, blah. I'd like to introduce a working definition of wetlands that was really coined by Greg Larson, who is standing right there. Greg is a longtime former Bowser employee. He now works for the Corps of Engineers, St. Paul District, as a wetlands ecologist. And Greg defined wetlands as, wetlands are low spots in the landscape where people gather to argue. And that's what's going on in this photo right here. And then it occurs in all different ways. It occurs with projects, it occurs with policies, laws, regulations, and so forth. And it occurs at different scales. It occurs at the driveway scale, the county scale, the watershed scale, at the state capitol, all the way up to Washington. So I like that definition of wetlands, and that's what we typically go with. So if you've read the title of my talk, it shouldn't be any surprise that this is what I'm going to talk about, but I'd like to start with just a few disclaimers. First of all, some timing issues. I'm going to be talking mostly about things that have occurred and that I've observed during my career. I started working to some extent with wetlands in Indiana back in 1983. I started with the DNR in 1988, became the DNR Wetlands Program Coordinator in 1991. But there are some things I'm going to refer to that occurred well before my time. For example, I was not around when they were using steam dredges to drain the prairie. That was not on my watch. But for the most part, I'll stick to things that have happened during my career. The other disclaimer that I'd like to throw out there has to do with the fact that there are other people in this room that could probably do a better job with this sort of retrospective on wetlands than I can. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge Ray Norgard. He would be a very good speaker in this way, partly because Ray is much more long-standing than I am, and Ray is sitting back there. So the other thing is that Ray has some perspectives from both the governmental and the non-governmental experiences. So for those of you who have things to add, feel free to shout stuff out, and we can take advantage of everybody's experiences. So we're going to start talking about changes in habitat, and I'm going to begin by talking about invasive species, and to start with plants. When I started with the DNR back in 1988, purple loosestrife was a huge deal. Many of you know Luke Skinner, who was used to be the DNR Ecological and Water Resources Division Director, now works for Three Rivers Parks. Luke was the purple loosestrife coordinator. We had a position devoted just to that, and we all kind of hated Luke because he got to go to Sweden, I think, twice on the state's dime to collect bugs to kill purple loosestrife. But it was actually very successful. And as you all know, purple loosestrife has not disappeared. It's still out there, but the prevalence of it has gone way down, partly because of those biocontrol efforts. That's not true. I'm using the wrong button. That's not true of this next species, reed canary grass. Dan mentioned that. We all hate reed canary grass. The rise of reed canary grass has been pretty remarkable during my career. It's completely taken over most of the wet meadows, particularly in the southern and the agricultural parts of the state. Once it's established, it's very, very hard to eradicate. There are some methods that people have used. It's very management intensive to take care of. It's kind of interesting that we've always talked about reed canary grass as being a non-native invasive species. There's a recent paper that just came out where they did some genetics work and are finding, and at least their finding is that reed canary grass is a native species. So I'll be curious to hear more about that, but this has certainly been one of the things that we've observed during my time is this adverse impact from reed canary grass. Similarly, and perhaps of more consequence for wildlife management, is the rise of narrowleaf and hybrid cattail. This clearly is a huge issue, again, particularly in the prairie and the agriculture and urban parts of the state. Creates these giant monotypes of cattails. It's extremely difficult to manage. We're putting a lot of effort into managing cattail, and we'll mention a little bit more about that later. But that again is another invasive plant that has had huge impacts on habitat quality in wetlands during my career. The next potential villain is Phragmites, or giant reed grass. Giant reed grass, or Phragmites, is native to Minnesota, as most of you know, but there is an invasive phenotype out there. It's a huge problem in the eastern U.S., as close as Wisconsin. Completely takes over wetlands, completely chokes them out. It's not as big of a problem in Minnesota yet. The University of Minnesota has got a program going on where they're trying to identify the locations of this invasive Phragmites. Hopefully we can get on top of that, and that won't become the type of invasive that we've seen so far with reed canary grass and hybrid cattail. So I could talk about the ultimate wetland invader as far as plants, but I'm really not going to go there today. So let's move on to some invasive animals. Obviously carp and to some extent bullheads are the classic wetland invasive species on the animal side. This is nothing new. This is not something that's occurred during my time. I would like to mention fathead minnows and other minnows can also be a problem for wetlands. There's good evidence that they can cause trophic effects in wetlands and shallow lakes. They are native, unlike carp. They are native, so they're not new, but one of the things that is new with all these fishes is the connectivity that we've created in the landscape through the extensive tiling and ditching that allows these species to recolonize and to get into new wetlands. So that's something that we have seen perhaps during my career, is that additional connectivity. Another aspect is the lower incidence of severe winters and winter kill that kills these fish off. And we've not been having winter kills to the extent that we have before, so these species persist in wetlands and can create problems. And hard to say at this point, but that perhaps could be due to climate change. And then finally, our beloved walleye, I got to mention that as well. It's not really a wetland species, but over 1,000 wetlands and shallow lakes in Minnesota are used for walleye rearing. Their effect on the ecology isn't quite as straightforward as some of the others, but there is evidence that they can have some adverse impacts. So, invasives with fish. Emerald ash borer. You're all aware of that. This is a looming disaster for Minnesota's wetlands. Minnesota has over 1 million acres of black ash swamp. If and when emerald ash borer kills those off, as they have in many other states, the effects on those wetlands are largely unknown. We expect that there will be rising water tables. It's likely that those wetlands will convert into something else, perhaps shrub swamps, perhaps emergent wetlands, and potentially more seas of hybrid cattail. So this is something to be paying attention to as we go forward. It's an emerging threat as far as wetlands. And then finally, I thought I'd throw in this photo of a rarely seen aquatic animal, or invasive animal, the rare aquatic black Angus. These appear to key in on reed or on wild rice. They're apparently not very common right now, but where they do occur, it can be a huge issue for those basins. Okay, let's talk about contaminants. We're still talking about habitat changes. Let's get into some contaminants. Obviously, nitrogen and phosphorus are a huge problem. These aren't anything new. Everybody's aware of that. They can drive changes in wetland plant communities. They particularly favor invasive species like reed canary grass and hybrid cattail. What is an emerging threat, though, is chloride. And chloride can also be a big problem for wetlands and lakes, aquatic habitats. They are toxic at higher concentrations. It can be toxic to aquatic invertebrates. It can change aquatic plant communities. And this is a kind of a vexing problem because there's really no obvious solutions. It's primarily limited to metropolitan and urban, suburban areas where the use of road de-icing salt is a big deal. But there are not many practical alternatives to the use of road salt for de-icing. And the problem with chloride is that it doesn't degrade. It just accumulates in the sediment in the water column, and the concentrations continue to increase. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out as we go forward, but this is a newly emerging threat that we should be paying attention to. All right, let's talk about hydrology. Obviously a huge issue. Now, tiling is not new. People have been tiling and draining wetlands since the turn of the previous century. But what is new is the rise of pattern tiling, and that has been amazing during my time at the DNR. In the early 2000s, the Minnesota Extension Service put out a small publication where they noted that 19,000 miles of tile were being installed annually in Minnesota at that time. And if you can see that map there, it shows that 37% of the cropland acres in Minnesota are tiled. To be fair, a lot of the new pattern tiling isn't on wetlands. It's not actively draining wetlands. It's often installed on lands where the wetlands were already drained, or even on uplands as strictly a soil moisture management technique. But where this pattern tiling is going in, it's not hard to imagine that it can lower that regional water table. And even if you don't extend that tiling through the wetland itself, by surrounding that wetland with tile, you're disrupting superficial water flows, and that can cause indirect drainage of these wetlands. So this whole thing with pattern tiling that I and others have noted is a profound hydrologic experiment. We're completely replumbing the entire landscape out there, and I'm not sure we're going to be too happy with the outcome at some point. Related to tiling is the issue of tile inlets, and this isn't the best photo, but this is the Swan Lake wetland complex, and all these dots that you see on there are tile inlets that are inletting into the Swan Lake wetland complex. So you can imagine if you got enough of those, it's going to start to have some hydrologic effects in terms of making the system much more flashy in response to precipitation events. And it's also pumping nitrogen into those things. So the whole thing with tiling, the hydrologic effects of tiling itself, and the fact that we have these tile inlets outletting into many wetlands, particularly including wetlands on public lands, is a huge issue and something we've been seeing more of. I want to mention the loss of seasonal and temporary wetlands. Again, this is nothing particularly new, but what it illustrates is that, and this is a photo, an aerial photo of part of Big Stone County. The green blobs that you see there are drained wetlands, restorable wetlands. This is from the restorable wetlands inventory. And most of the small ones that you see on there are temporary and seasonal basins. And those are the majority of what we have lost on the landscape. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is a very long-standing reason, and that is the fact that they were the easiest to drain. So that was been occurring for a century or more. There's a newer reason that's maybe not quite as prevalent, but is still kind of interesting. It's a thing that we refer to as consolidation, and it's an aspect of the regulatory scheme where when people drain wetlands, they need mitigation. So they'll often drain temporary and seasonal basins, but when they get mitigation, they'll restore a permanent water. So we end up consolidating a lot of small temporary seasonal basins, and what's left on the landscape are the large seasonal or the large permanent waters. And this obviously works against the concept of having good wetland complexes. So I just wanted to mention that. Again, this is not anything particularly new, but this aspect of consolidation is something we've seen since the rise of wetland regulatory programs. A real problem that is beginning to show up, and many of you may be aware of this, is groundwater appropriation. I've been working for the DNR for 32 years now. There's a statistic that I saw that over the past 37 years, the incidence of irrigated cropland has nearly doubled in Minnesota. And this can have clear impacts on wetlands. So here's a specific example where a landowner installed some irrigation wells adjacent to a DNR public water. And take a look at that hydrograph and take a guess as when he turned the pumps on. So it's not hard to see. The end result is that it just sucked all the water right out of the bottom of that wetland. This is getting to be a very big issue. You may be aware that the DNR has established 3 groundwater management areas. This is the Bonanza Valley in western Stearns, eastern Pope County. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Litchfield and Morris wetland management districts are very concerned about the impacts of water withdrawal on their WMA. So they've begun a wetland hydrology monitoring program to evaluate the effects of groundwater withdrawal on those wetlands. Actually, we lack really good data on the hydrology of natural wetlands. So this is kind of amazing. We have 100 years of data or more on streams and lakes. We really lack long-term data on wetland hydrology, wetland and particularly wetlands that are natural, high-quality reference condition wetlands. So to address that, we have just begun to implement a long-term wetland hydrology monitoring program. This is the scheme that we've laid out. We intend to install permanent wetland monitoring equipment on about 60 wetlands around the state, stratified both by plant community and geography, ecological region. We have an EPA grant right now where we're beginning to install some of these wells, some of the monitoring wells. We have a recommendation from the last go-around of the LCCMR for some additional funding. So we're beginning to do this. We're installing wells as we speak to try to begin to develop this long-term record of how natural wetlands behave hydrologically so that we can assess what are the impacts from this groundwater withdrawal and other hydrologic impacts. So something to pay attention to as we go forward here. And then finally, in terms of hydrology, I put climate change in there. It's kind of the wild card. We don't really know what the effect is going to be. We're going to have apparently warmer temperatures, much more intensive precipitation events. The timing of those is going to change. I'm not sure we know what the long-term effects of that are going to be, but certainly that's another aspect that's going to perhaps create adverse effects on the state's wetlands. Kind of to sum up the habitat change aspect of this is kind of shocking to me. This is a portion of the table showing the conservation status rank that is assigned to the different native plant communities by the DNR's Natural Heritage Program. And what this shows is that the prairie mixed cattail marsh and the prairie bulrush arrowhead marsh, according to our Natural Heritage Program, are critically imperiled. So what that means is it is becoming extremely difficult to find true native plant communities of these types. And that to me is almost unbelievable that these would be classified as an S1 conservation status rank. Okay, let's talk about management changes. And I will confess that this is not my strong suit. I have not been directly involved with wetland management throughout my career, but I do hear a fair amount about it. So if any of the rest of you, many of you have a lot more experience than I do, so feel free to pipe up if there's some things that you want to bring forward. One thing I would mention is that when I started my career, dugouts were a really big thing. We spent a lot of our time dealing with landowners, and also we were digging holes on our own WMAs to create open water. So we developed guidance and so forth, and the concern is that in many cases we were converting pretty high quality wet meadows and wet prairies to open water, or perhaps to cattail. And that was a concern. Over the years, it's become less of a concern, and I'm not sure if the incidence of it has been decreasing. One of the things I suspect, though, is that with the rise of reed canary grass, the rise of hybrid cattail, the concern over digging those holes has probably gone down. I know at some point it occurred to me that if you've got somebody with a wet meadow that is just a sea of reed canary grass, digging a hole in it and creating some open water is certainly no worse than the reed canary grass. So it seems like our emphasis on dealing with dugouts has gone down over the years. Another management change we've seen, I think we've been spending a lot more time in getting a lot more sophisticated with water level management for different reasons, partly to try to mimic natural cycles, which are disrupted for a number of things that we've already talked about, partly to deal with fish management, and then taken to the ultimate degree is moist soil management, which is highly dependent on managing water levels. So that's been a thing that is, I think, become more prevalent during my career, is that aspect of water level management. And then similarly, our attention to vegetation establishment has also increased. In the past, we tended, when we restored a wetland, we just put some water on it and wait and see what happens. I think with the rise of invasive species, we're paying a lot more attention to everything that it takes to establish high-quality native plant communities on these. One of the indicators of this, and Dan mentioned it earlier, is the rise of native plant seed suppliers. That was pretty rare back when I started. Now there's dozens of them, and so they're all providing seed source and rootstock for restored wetlands. The long-term prognosis for this is hard to say. Reed canary grass, hybrid cattail are pretty persistent, but at least we're paying a lot more attention to trying to get these things established on a proper trajectory. So I've been talking a fair amount about hybrid cattail. Obviously, we're spending a lot more time managing that, a lot more time and money. There's different ways to do it. There's machines like this that chop it up. This is up in Voyageurs National Park. We can spray it. I know the DNR is doing both of these things. Or you can rip them out one by one, which may not be as efficient, but from the expression on Ray's face, it appears to be a lot more emotionally satisfying. So. And then finally, in terms of management changes, one of the things that I would mention is we're becoming, and this is a positive development, I'll try and point those out as I go through here, but we're becoming much more strategic in terms of where we're doing restoration. Rather than doing the random acts of conservation that we did before in terms of restorations, where it was all dependent on willing landowners that came forward. We now have a number of different types of planning efforts that are showing us where the best places are to both restore and protect wetlands, where they're going to do the most good, where they're most likely to be successful to create good wetland complexes and working landscapes to provide high quality habitat. Okay, let's switch gears here and talk about regulation changes. So I started again with the DNR in the late 1980s. The public waters inventory is part of the DNR's Public Waters Permit Program. The public waters inventory was completed in the late 1970s. And when I started to work for the DNR, that was still kind of a big deal. It was still pretty controversial. There were a number of lawsuits going on at the time challenging the public waters inventory. People were still very upset in many cases with the DNR. People were still getting, cussed out and so forth over our attempt to manage wetlands. Over the succeeding years until now, I think it's become much more accepted. We have a whole new generation of landowners. There are clearly some exceptions out there. There are still some people who are very upset about it, but we don't hear the same level of concern over the DNR's public waters inventory. So that's been a positive thing. And one thing I would point out is under our Public Waters Permit Program, private development on public waters wetlands is simply prohibited. And obviously that was a big deal at the beginning, and it's kind of unique, I think, nationally. But generally, over time, I think people have become accepted of that, and for the most part, people know just not to even ask to build a Walmart, say, on a public waters wetland. Clearly, the biggest, most defining regulatory change for my career was the passage of the Wetlands Conservation Act in 1991. In fact, it was the Wacka, as we call it, created my position at the DNR. So even with the DNR Public Waters Permit Program and the Public Waters Inventory, the vast majority of wetlands prior to the passage of Wacka were unregulated in Minnesota. So for several years leading up to 1991, in the late 80s, there were several runs, unsuccessful runs, at passing more comprehensive wetland legislation. One of the bills that was authored by a representative, Marcus Marsh, which I thought was sort of interesting, but ultimately, in 1991, the Wetland Conservation Act passed literally in the last minute of that session. Representative Willard Munger was a huge driver of the passage of the Wetlands Conservation Act. There were a number of other people that were very instrumental of that. Another interesting fact was that until there was a conference committee that had to reconcile both a House and a Senate bill, and the intention at the time was to basically expand the DNR's regulatory program, and it would have gone to, the Wacka program would have gone to DNR. At some point during that conference committee, which came as a surprise to everybody, the program was given to Bowser and for implementation by local governments. So that was a bit of a surprise. And it set up kind of a whole new scheme for regulation in Minnesota. And as you can imagine, many of the counties, particularly in the northern part of the state where you can't turn around without falling into a wetland, were very concerned about this. And so there were lots of headlines like this where the Roseau County wants the state to tone down the wetland rules and regulations, and Senator Stump says he's going to seek a repeal of the Wetland Conservation Act. So there was a lot of pushback when Wacka was passed. We heard a lot of concern, particularly from the northern counties. In fact, there was an organization formed, a coalition of 11 northern counties that for quite a while refused to sign on to implementation of the Wetland Conservation Act. And it wasn't until some changes were made in the rules and regulations that satisfied them that they began to sign on. Associated with that was some staffing issues. So all of a sudden we set up 300 local governments, cities, counties, townships, watershed districts, to start regulating wetlands, and many of them were not at all interested in doing that. And a lot of them consequently assigned the wetland regulatory business to their septic tank inspectors or their dog catchers or the deputy sheriff. And so that created some big issues with training and expertise and so forth. But since then, and a lot of the credit goes to Bowser and their oversight, but also a whole generation of people were hired by the local governments, people who were trained in water resource management, who were ecologists, who were vested in the program. And so there are still LGUs out there that are probably not terribly enthusiastic about their responsibilities with Wetland Conservation Act. But by and large, we see a much more professional, much more capable level of staffing for Wacka out there than what occurred early in the passage of this. I had to throw this in here. This is an excerpt from a comment letter that was provided on the early rules of the Wacka. And so it just gives you a flavor of some of the response. I'll just read it. It says, everybody is not happy with these severe wetland regulations. Think of what a disgruntled person could do if he took the attitude, don't get mad, get even. He could retaliate by seeding our lakes with Eurasian milfoil or rough. They're even more undesirable available. And what a catastrophe if that were to happen. Think it would only take one disgruntled person, so please ease up on these ridiculous portions. So I thought that was pretty interesting. If you were to write that letter today, you'd probably end up in federal prison because it's some sort of a terroristic threat, I suppose. But it gives you some idea of the flavor of and what the atmosphere was like back then. One of the real success stories, I think, of Wacka was the formation of technical evaluation panels. These are a statutory, how many does that say? 10, thank you. I can't read with these glasses on that far away. The technical evaluation panels were set up by the Wacka statute. They're comprised of a person from the local government unit that is administering the act, a person from Bowser, and then the Soil and Water Conservation District. And so those panels are formed to provide technical advice to the local governments on the decisions they have to make about approving or disapproving Wetland Conservation Act applications. And I think these interagency panels, there's a requirement that they be trained, and I think that those panels have been very, very successful in providing good objective information to the local governments in making their decisions. They don't always follow the advice of the Wacka technical panels, and there are some technical panels that probably aren't so hot. But in general, I think this has been a very successful way to provide good information to the LGUs. Has helped improve the outcomes, the regulatory outcomes of Wacka overall. Another regulatory thing that we've observed, at least that I've observed during my time, is the evolution of wetland mitigation banking. When Wacka was first passed, when the Clean Water Act was first being administered on the federal level, people got permission to fill a wetland, and then they had to come up with their own mitigation. So they were digging holes in the ground, they were doing wetland restorations that were really pretty crappy. Over the years, we've seen a rise in wetland banking. And this is a screenshot from the Corps of Engineers website. This is the metro area right here, but all these things are either proposed or existing wetland banks. And so it's become the norm now that when people need mitigation credits, they buy the credits from banks. And we are much better at creating banks. There's a lot more oversight that goes into creating wetland banks, and a lot more long-term management than the mitigation that was being done by individuals before then. Minnesota has more wetland banks and the largest wetland bank in the country. So this has been a really interesting development over time, is the incidence of wetland banking. Okay, those were things on the state side. I'm going to talk a little bit about things on the federal side in terms of regulatory changes. And it's pretty short. Really, it all comes back to these guys, the Supremes. The Clean Water Act was amended in the late 1970s that kind of created the current program. And at the time, as you all know, it's the Corps of Engineers that's responsible for administering the Section 404, the wetland permitting part of the Clean Water Act. At the time back then, they didn't want to have anything to do with it. They were the agency that built dams and created, channelized streams. So they were not at all interested in regulating wetlands. Well, that led to a series of lawsuits by conservation organizations. And over time, eventually, the Corps of Engineers was regulating everything. They were literally regulating all the wetlands in the country. Well, that led to a bunch of lawsuits. And so we're still at this point today trying to find the balance between what is appropriate to be regulated under the Clean Water Act, and most of it ends up here at the Supreme Court. And you may be aware of some of the recent court cases. You may be aware also of the rules that have been proposed by the Obama administration, now the new rules being proposed by the Trump administration, and those are all going to end up back here at the Supreme Court as well, in the absence of Congress stepping in. Part of the problem is that we're dealing with a fairly vaguely worded law, federal law in that regard. And to be honest, it is kind of an interesting policy dilemma that is trying to balance federal constitutional powers with the role of states and their rights. So, one thing I would mention, another thing in terms of the federal regulation changes, is the 1985 Farm Bill. That was a big deal. the incidence of wetland loss following the passage of the 85 Farm Bill went way down. The swamp buster provisions of the Farm Bill really did a lot to save wetlands across the country. Next, in terms of regulatory changes, if you haven't already, you're going to soon be hearing about our proposal for the state of Minnesota to assume the Section 404 program, the federal wetland permitting program. Under that provision of the federal law, a state that administers its own regulatory programs under their own authority can apply to the EPA to take over, essentially, the Section 404 program. And if EPA determines that the state program provides an equivalent level of protection from Section 404, then there's no longer, they will certify the program. The state assumes that a landowner or a permit applicant no longer has to get a separate federal permit. They will only need a state permit. So we did a feasibility study completed in 2017. There's another feasibility study going on right now, or not a feasibility study, there's another project going on to develop an assumption application. The state hasn't decided to do that yet, but I would say the odds are very strong that we will eventually apply to assume Section 404, in which case you will no longer need a federal Section 404 permit. Another thing you're going to hear about, if you haven't already, is an in lieu fee program. And this is yet another evolution of wetland mitigation. Under an in lieu fee program, if you get a permit to fill a wetland, you will be able to just pay somebody to do mitigation. And that sounds kind of bad, but I'll have to admit that it's probably better to have somebody who's really good at doing wetland restorations, and in Minnesota it will probably end up going to the Board of Water and Soil Resources, and they've developed a lot of expertise at doing that. We'll probably get better mitigation by having people pay into a fund and having Bowser go out there and do mitigations where they make the most sense, following the prairie plan, the one watershed plans, all those planning documents, and having expertise to do a good job. So this is something you're going to hear more about. Bowser is in the process of implementing this, again, a further evolution of wetland banking. So that's our wetland mitigation. So those are some things coming next. So finally, some lessons learned. I think some of those are in the handout that you have, and there are some additional ones that I might mention. One is a few things that I've learned over the years is, one, don't attempt to walk across a floating bog. Stay away from the Capitol building if you can avoid it. Don't tell people in Coochin County that you're the DNR Wetlands Program Coordinator. And then finally, this is good advice for everybody, is to be nice to everybody because they may be your next boss. But more to the topic at hand, I guess a few things I'll mention, and you can read these, but again, it's better to prevent impacts than to try to fix things afterwards. Once wetlands get screwed up, it's really hard to fix them. Reed canary grass, hybrid cattail, carp, all those things are nearly intractable problems. So part of our charge is try to avoid the next carp, the next reed canary grass, if at all possible. Another lesson is the need for management. With the incidents and the number of stressors out there on wetlands, we can't just protect them, restore them, and protect them and leave them alone. Some kind of management is really necessary in order to maintain high quality habitat. We need to continue to be more strategic with where and how we do restorations. We need to be following those plans that have been put out there, so we're creating high quality working landscapes, wetland complexes that provide the kind of habitat that the public demands. And along those lines, we need and continue to need public support. And it's not just general public support. We need people that are willing to contact their legislators. It really doesn't mean much to a legislator for a wetland program, DNR Wetlands Program Coordinator, to come over there and testify. What really does mean a lot to them is for their constituents to call them up and talk to them about wetland protection. So that is something we need to continue to foster. And then wetland regulations, in my experience, we have a very complicated wetland regulatory picture in Minnesota. We got the Public Waters Permit Program, we got Wacka, we got Section 404, who's the LGU, all those kind of things lead to a pretty complicated picture. Wetland regulations work best when they're simple. And it's my experience that most project applicants are okay with being regulated as long as it's straightforward and they have ready access to doing what they need to do. So for instance, in terms of getting wetland mitigation done. They can accept the fact that they're going to be regulated and there may be limits on their project. What really gets them going, though, are uncertainties or complications and inefficiencies. So to the extent that we can craft our programs to be efficient and simple, people are okay even if they're told no, as long as they know what the story is and what to expect. And then finally, to maybe try to end on a little bit of a bright note, I will mention that we have perhaps the most robust wetlands monitoring, long-term acreage monitoring program in the country, where we do aerial photo sampling over about 5,000 square miles in the state. And over the last 13 years when we've been doing this, I will tell you that the data shows that we're holding even with the acreage of wetlands in Minnesota. It's not to say that there's wetlands not being drained, because they are, but we're also seeing increases. We're seeing wetlands restored, and then part of the story is probably as I think Dan or Norm, I can't remember, showed some slides that showed things are getting wetter. So climatically, things are getting wetter, wetlands are expanding. Hard to say what might happen when we go into a drought the next time around, but at least for now, I can tell you that we are holding steady with the acreage of wetlands in Minnesota. So with that, I think I'm done. Questions? Okay.
I think that will cut loose and go live. Doug will be around a little later on for the panel discussion, so if you have any